Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Victor Dandridge. He is the man behind Vantage Inhouse. So Victor, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, I'm just going to say Vantage Inhouse is a company that we may not have heard of. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it is you do.
Yes, I've been a self-publishing full-time creator for the last 8 years through Vantage Inhouse Productions. It's my creator-owned imprint, much in the same way of your Miller World or your Jinx World that are run by Mark Miller and Brian Michael Bendis, respectively. And it's the home of some award-winning self-published comics that I've put out specifically as the writer over the last few years.
Okay, so when you say self-publishing, this is, you're not going to, let's say, Marvel or DC. You're basically having to do all of the legwork yourself to get in touch with the folks that you're collaborating with, the publishing company that actually prints the books, and distributing it to stores. So how do you go about that process? So let's say you're talking about one of your award-winning books. You get the idea. How do you contact the artist? How do you get that ball rolling?
I'm a guy that's been in the convention market for some time, so you actually run into a lot of similar circles with a lot of very talented people, and it's really kind of your job to use those opportunities as networking. And so because of the different people that I've met, I'm familiar with people with many different styles. So when I have a story that fits a particular model or an interest point to a creator that I've met along the way, I'll reach out and see if they're available and try to orchestrate a nice system for how we can work together to produce a new product.
You know, it's funny because you see a lot on Twitter that people get upset when you approach an artist and say, I want to work on a project and I want you to do it for free. So you're obviously not doing that. So there's a whole business side to it, and you're using the conventions as a networking opportunity. So if I were going to a convention, I've got an idea for a great story. How would I approach somebody in a way that lets them know that I'm serious and that I probably will understand a few more things than just some guy who said, well, you should do it for free. It's exposure.
The E word has become a pretty dirty, derogatory sort of statement, but I'm not too far removed from it. I do another, we'll call it a lesson plan of sorts called unconventional, which is kind of my weird ways of operating in the comic book industry. And part of that kind of belies the notion of if me as a self-publisher am interested in working with you, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to ask you how much you charge to do something. I have a certain amount of money that I'm able to spend at any given time on any given project. And with full transparency, I present that as a budgetary confinement to this project. So I'll approach someone and say, hey, I've got X amount of dollars to do this many pages of this book. Are you game? Yes or no? I can tell them, hey, I'm interested in working with you. Do you want to, get a quick synopsis so you can see if this is something that you're even interested in? If you're not interested, then we're not even going to talk money. There's no need because you're not interested. If you're not available, we also don't need to talk money. So it's kind of like opening that door, and then I'll present that first offering and say, okay, this is what I have. Yes or no. That's just the initial commission sort of aspect of it. I believe that when it comes to making comic books especially, there are 4 ways that you can get compensation. And that initial commission, honestly, is like maybe, it can be honestly like the 3rd to 2nd highest grossing compensation method possible. And that's also, like you said, the business aspect of what we're looking for. So the highest form clearly is a percentage of IP ownership. I have 2 books in particular that I share 50-50 ownership with the artists. Even though the concept might have been mine originally, I wanted to instill in them a sense of faith in what I'm doing with the project and everything like that, that says that, if you invest in me and in this project at a lowball number, when we take this to a higher platform, we all will make more money. It's not going to be a matter of, you made me rich, we made each other rich. And, that's number 1. So percentage of IP is a big one. I'm also big on giving the artist full ownership of all the artwork. A lot of people are like, well, that's just customary. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not the legal rule. The legal rule is as work for hire, me as the commissioner, that work is mine. It actually legally counts as though I authored it, even though it was not my hand that actually made it happen. That's the legal ramifications of work for hire. So I say, no, you keep all the artwork and say, I managed to get a deal, and God forbid I don't aim for such things, but say I got a deal where I only ended up paying you $20 a page, but you were able to, present some artwork and a story that was so phenomenal that it deservedly should get $100 on the actual art market. Well, you've made 5 times what I gave you in terms of that page, and that money should be yours. That has nothing to do with me. That's you marketing yourself even further and building a sales platform off of what this project will be. And then of course last and honestly least in a lot of ways is profitability off of the final sale of product. But of course that accounts for, first I have to make back the money that I spent on you plus printing, so that profit margin becomes infinitely smaller. So because I'm that guy that offers so many different ways of compensating you, I become a lot more reasonable to work with.
You seem to have a really good handle on how to speak to people in a business point of view. I mean, I think a lot of people who go to the conventions who have that idea think of themselves as an artist, but in fact, you are an artist business person, and that's something that really has to be considered. So as that business person, when you're looking at, putting together this book, you come up with this idea, and you said that you are willing to share 50-50 with your co-creator. So how does that collaboration work? Are you giving them a script and saying it must be drawn this way? Or are you saying, we're on this project together and you can interpret it and I can, go with what you've got at a certain point?
One of the things that is very customary with a lot of creators on the writing side is, oh, this is my story, and they take full ownership. This is a collaborative medium. That's number 1, 2, and 3. You have to recognize that there are going to be times that your vision is not the final say and may not be the best version. A lot of people, if you think about it like this, Alexander Graham Bell, when he first created the telephone, had a specific idea in mind. There were cords, there were wires, but we have devices today that are just as great, if not greater, of an invention of the telephone that don't function nearly in the same capacity of what he envisioned. They are far beyond so many more things. But the idea of just keeping it limited to that initial thought is kind of it's a mistake. What's the point of me getting creative collaborators if I only want them to do what I say? I don't want to put myself in that position like I'm the best. So when I write scripts, and I just got teased about this by some of my buddies, I'm very verbose and wordy in my scripts because I'm trying to tell the artist the story, but I leave the interpretation up to them. My whole point is I just want you to capture the mood and the tone that I'm trying to present to you. If you can show it to me in a way that's different than what I described, that's your job. You have to stand by the visual narrative. I have to stand by the concept and the execution. So when it comes to you, making your lane, that is your job, and I'm not to step into that unless it totally undermines the overall goal or the long-term, showcase of what we're trying to tell.
Let's talk about telling the story so that the audience can get their hands on it. Now, I know that you use conventions as this networking possibility. Is this a way also that you can connect to possible readers? Because I'm imagining that publishing's got to be expensive. I don't know if you do crowdfunding or not, but how do you get your idea into their hands?
With your calling me of being an artist businessman, you're 100% right. I am fully invested in page-by-page copies and finishing. It is a local print on-demand sort of location. It's run by Brian Dalton, and I was one of his first customers, and he's now grown to cover a lot of indie publishers and provide print materials for them at very low cost. Allows for not only for you to make profit off of your books, but also to be able to offer wholesale values when you're trying to go into shops. So beyond just comic book conventions, he also has set everything up so that when you want to sell to the main market, the direct market, you can still find profitability off of that. At conventions, I do a ton of comic book oriented events every year. I think over the last 5 years, my average is like 32 to 40 comic themed events throughout the year, whether that's direct conventions, whether that's me going into schools, teaching. I'll even look, I'm the guy that sets up premiere weekend of a comic book movie. I'll go to the theater and set up in their lobby and talk to people right then and there, because again, it's looking at who is interested in comic-based material and going to find them. You know, it's all about that notion of not saying, oh, I created this great thing and people will come to me. Let me go give it to them. There's so many things that can draw their attention elsewhere. Let me be right there and let me create this experience that they want me to be a part of. And that's basically how I engage with people at conventions. You know, when you go to a convention, there's celebs, there's far bigger names than me. There's all kinds of things for people to see and do and engage. How do I make them care about what I'm doing? First thing is to be fully engaging. One of the things that you'll rarely see me do at a convention is sit down. You know, I stand the whole time. And that was at the earlier days. Like now I'm at a point where I do celebrity moderating. So that also leads to an interesting point where you see me on stage with a famous person, a celebrity of note, and you're like, well, who is this guy? And then you find out a little bit more about me, and my fan base has grown because of that. So there's a lot of different levels to how you can engage with people, but that's the key, is to find a way to engage with them, but also have the background set up where it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to sell to them at a reasonable rate.
A lot of times we think about independent publishers as being able to take a risk with their characters, being able to tell a story that might not be the blockbuster. So if I'm working on Batman for DC, I'm probably not going to, well, first off, if I'm doing it, good for me. But if I'm working at DC, I'm probably not going to be able to make wholesale changes to Batman, because he's got to be returned to the way he was so that the next creative team can come in and work on this. But you've got a lot more flexibility, and I think, judging by what I saw on your website, you are able to take some risks. So when you're working on a story and you have maybe superheroics, you're also able to work in that human element. I'm wondering how it is that you kind of work in that vein.
For me, I don't look down on superhero comics. It's what brought me into comics. And a lot of times you'll get indie creators that don't really show a lot of love towards the mainstream side of things. To kind of have that separation, I've kind of dubbed it the indie, I-N-D-I-E versus I-N-D-Y. And the I-N-D-I-Eers are more of the alternative underground comic guys that are, you know, all about making more slice of life stories. They don't really like superhero stuff. It's a little too polished. It's a little too slick. It's not their bag, which is fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. Harvey Pekar is a great example of a guy that wasn't really his bag, but he told phenomenal stories, you know? Me, I'm an I-N-D-Y guy. I love mainstream stuff. I love superheroes. So even though I'm not corporately funded, I want to tell superhero-esque stories. And really, if I'm going to do it, the point should be not to just tell a story, but what is my version of that story? My version of that story will be to find a way to humanize some things. My book, The Trouble with Love, is essentially Superman, but it's a Superman that has an affair. So in that regard, oh, that's a different take. DC would never let us do that story where Superman steps out on Lois Lane. Get out of here. I would get laughed out of the room. But it's an interesting take because, again, it focuses more on the man over the super. And that's something a lot of people are aiming to see when it comes to a character like that. So I can do that, whereas DC might not be able to.
It's interesting, too, because I think when we look at the DC cinematic universe, they always sort of play up the godlike qualities of their characters. And what you're doing is you're stripping away that quality and making it the human quality that we can all, you know, the little foibles and quirks that we have in our personality. And is that something that, when you're doing that, is it easier for you to bring real life into a fantastical situation as a result?
Sometimes it's harder because when you are presented with a regular person and their reaction to a common everyday event, even this something as extreme as adultery or infidelity or something like that, when you have a person that has the capacity to respond at a higher level, you have to bring a sense of authenticity to it that's a little harder. Again, my book, The Samaritan, with The Samaritan, which I dub, it's a mashup of Unbreakable, which great series, I love the whole thing, and Roadhouse. Which again, I love that movie. So, and it's not one that most Black people are going to be like, Roadhouse, really? What? But the notion of a Superman-esque character who is African American, who specifically doesn't wear a costume so that he can move into crime-ridden neighborhoods and not stand out. You know, it's taking this notion of Superman, making him not just a Black guy, but let's put him in an urban setting and make that make sense. This is a guy that aims to affect the community, not with this lofty ideal of inspiration, but to physically be there and to course correct, you know, the injustices that happen, not just to us, but by us, and really kind of put, you know, hands to you know, to people's behinds to make sure that that happens. those things take, you know, it takes a little bit more thought into, oh, I just want to make a superhero that's black, or I want to make a superhero, you know, in the neighborhood. No, it's got to be a little bit more than that. And to how, you know, he interacts with the different characters, it's trying to limit the notion of, okay, this is what I would do as a regular man, but I have to also pay attention that he's not regular. And those things should apply and should shape and form how he actually interacts with all these other people.
It's interesting because, you know, you are a true fan, and I've heard a lot of the old school creators say, you know, when the fans got in and started writing comics, then you start getting this, you know, decompressed storytelling where a story that Stan Lee would do in 2 pages, they take 4 weeks to, or 4 months to do. So now you have the advantage of being a fan, so you can think about characters and what you might do to change them. And you're also a publisher, you're working on your own characters. But there's that business side where you only have so many dollars to spend on a book. So are you leaning towards the decompressed storytelling, or sort of the, let's get right to the nuts and bolts and tell a good story fast?
I'm all about telling story. Story is God to me. It's one of those things where, not to detract from Vantage Inhouse or derail from that, but the Green Lantern movie with Ryan Reynolds that most of us lampoon and despise. I literally remember watching the movie and being at a point where I was like, okay, this is whatever. Like, this doesn't even affect me one way or the other. I don't care, until we got to the end, and the continuity that they had established, they went rearing off from, and I was like, well, now you've just killed story. And that's what, you know, really, really bothered me about that movie. When story is the thing, that's all that matters. So I've got books that are only 8 pages in length as an issue, and they tell that story, and we move on and keep going. I've got other books that are 24, 27 pages that tell that story and move forward. It's always about the story. It's not about necessarily trying to squeeze into any particular budget. My job and my goal as a creative is to have something that totally represents my idea. And if I shortchange myself because, oh, I can't spend this money, then I'm not doing my job well. You know, it's one of those things where if I can't afford to do it, stop, save up, do what I can to get that money in order to tell the story as it needs to be told.
A lot of times people are just going to focus on, well, let me just get something out there. But you're focusing on, let's get something out there and get it out there the right way. So
yes.
When you have a break between projects because you're working on building up the nest egg to get that project out, how are you engaging your fans, your readers, to make sure that they still know that you've got a great new project and they just have to be patient?
Social media is huge for that. It's a way to express things that you're currently working on, that you're planning to do. For Vantage Inhouse, what I have, in addition to my social media platforms, I also do a digital magazine called On the Horizon that is basically allowing me to express some of the things that are coming and to get people excited about what's happening behind the scenes and still stay engaged until they get a chance to read it. It's just a smart way of using the technology that we have. How, you know, it doesn't take a lot to create a couple of pages of a PDF, put it together and put it out there. And that's a placeholder of content until something more concrete towards your, you know, actual publishing business comes out. So it's a way of you know, building up that word of mouth, getting people interested, staying interested, and also to engage back and find out what they want to see from you. You know, it's a way to just kind of put as much stuff up against the wall and really see what sticks, and it not just be me working in my studio by myself in a cave and then possibly coming out in the daytime and not being aware of what anybody else is interested in. So that's a huge one. Another one for me is I do a video review series called Black, White, and Red All Over, where every week I'm going to a local comic shop. So I'm seeing what books are coming out. I'm paying attention to what the market is showing is out there, paying attention to what people are reading. I'm even making suggestions on what people should read. And even in that regard, I do something that sometimes I call Dare to Compare. When I read a book that's from the mainstream that has anything to do with what I'm producing or have produced, I'll make that comparison myself. I'll say that suggestion and say, hey, if you like this, check this thing out. You know, it's not that I'm competing against them. You know, I definitely feel like geek dollars can spread out across the board, and we can all eat. In that regard, my book, The Samaritan, a lot of people, a lot of people feel like the Marvel Netflix Luke Cage series borrowed a lot from my series. Even though Luke Cage is older than my series, this iteration, this presentation of Luke Cage has not always been in the comic books under any circumstance, and quite possibly could have. So what I tell people is, don't get mad about such a thing. I look at it and say, Luke Cage is a multi-million-dollar commercial for my book, and I didn't have to pay for it. How many people like Luke Cage and they're walking around with hoodies with gunshot holes in it? And I'm like, that's dope. Check out this other book. And they're like, oh my God, this is right in the same lane. $10. There you go. So, it's all about finding ways to get people interested, even when it's not directly the thing that you're producing at the moment. Find out what they're in, what they're doing, what they're following right now, what's out, what's hot, and stay, connected to that. Ride that wave. There's nothing wrong with that.
When you are working on a book, obviously you've got other things you have to take care of. There's your regular family life. There's the fact that, you've got a regular job that you have to do. So how do you kind of balance your schedule to make sure that you can sleep, you can pay the bills, and that you can see the people who are important to you? Oh yeah, and still go out and go to the different comic shops and work on your podcasts and all that other stuff. How do you kind of balance that out? How do you schedule your week?
I'm honestly living the dream. My regular 9-to-5 job is this. This is what I do for a living. And it has been my job for the last 8 years. I am a stay-at-home mogul, is what I call it. I have an 18-month-old daughter, and she's my boss of bosses, truthfully. And I really have to shape what I do throughout the day around her. But to make ends meet, my appearances at Comic Cons is a big one. I don't just do Comic Cons as a fan per se anymore, or as a typical creative. I have earned a way to be compensated to be at shows. So it's not just a matter of me going to a show and trying to make money. I've orchestrated and worked hard enough to where shows honestly have to pay me to be there. I bring a lot of content with that, and that helps. One of my big content producing aspects is my You Create Comics line, which allows for me to use my love of comic books and my own personal story of not really being interested in reading as a child until I got into comic books. And I've now shaped programming and products that allow me to go into schools and teach students a love of comic books and show them how they can use comic books, them and their teachers, how they can use that to kind of infuse a new perspective on learning, to really kind of showcase that being a geek is not just a nice pastime. There's money involved. There's entrepreneurship. There's all kinds of things that you can actually build through this if you are dedicated and passionate about what you're doing. And in that regard, I've worked with the Columbus Metropolitan Library, which is one of the top-rated libraries in the nation. Their summer reading program, I've been an aspect of that. Locally, I've also worked with Columbus Arts Festival. We have one of our major shopping centers, Easton Town Center, has a superhero day, and I've been a feature of that for the last few years. Again, really showcasing this notion of accessibility to the comic book medium, and there's so many people that are willing to pay for that. Just next week, literally next Wednesday, I'm starting my You Create Comics school at a local rec center in the neighborhood that I grew up, really to try to come back and say, I'm a child from this area, relatively young black guy, just like you. Look at what I can do, and look at what you can do if you find something of this nature and just pursue it. It doesn't have to be rap. It doesn't have to be sports. It can be whatever you want, as long as you are authentic and you're passionate about it. You can find a way. And I've been very, very fortunate to make some good money doing that.
You talk about the fact that you're writing, I guess, all-age educational comics. And I'm wondering, when you're working on that, it's got to be different than when you're working on something that's for a more sophisticated or mature audience. So how do you kind of work between that all-ages accessibility and something where there might be, heavier themes for a more grown-up audience? Again,
it's always about the story. When I get into a place to want to tell a particular story, I stay in that place until it's time to get out. There are times when what I do is I call the mess around and finish process, or at least that has been how I've done things. So as inspiration hits me, I live in it until it goes. And then I back up and I don't force anything. I allow for the next wave of inspiration to come. And it consequently allowed for me to work on multiple things at once till I get to a certain point where I go, oops, oh my goodness, I finished this. And then I can put something out. I'm not operating on the same monthly schedule as mainstream books are. So when a project is at a point where I'm ready to release it, I do, and that's it. So I'm not really beholden to inspiration needing to fit within a particular window. I get to decide by listening when I'm working on what.
So what you're saying is you work on a project only when the inspiration hits you, but at the same time you're disciplined enough to work till you get that story done.
That's pretty much it. I'm actually trying to take that level of discipline to a new level where I started a thing called Project Write Faster. And I got to give a shout out to my friend Jeremy Tyler, who has become a big fan of Vantage Inhouse Productions and really wants to see more stories come out. So whenever I post that I'm working on something, he's like, that's awesome, write faster. And so to take that into like true form, I've challenged myself through the first part of 2019 to write a script every 2 weeks. It's not the easiest thing, Lord knows. I've actually been quite successful so far, having been able to finish the first 2 scripts that I've done this year in only 10 days. And that's been a phenomenal experience. But again, it's one of those things where I'm at a point where the inspiration is just ready. And I think it becomes easier for me in that regard to just churn out content. I am bouncing back and forth between titles. The 2 scripts that I've written so far aren't of the same title. They are both issue 1s. So it is a lot of, bounce around and see exactly what I want to tell. And it's working very, very nicely. So it's really just kind of, yes, there is an aspect of discipline. You got to be disciplined about it. But that's it.
Well, Victor, I'm sorry we're out of time. It's amazing how quickly that half hour flew. I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out and talking with me today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.